is, they can't work out either, nor can I, is Tamara Littleton, who is the CEO and founder of The Social Element. Tamara, hello.
Hello there, lovely to see you all.
And below and slightly to my right is Kate Hartley, who is the co-founder of Polpeo. So, hello, Kate.
Hi, thanks for having us on.
No problem. Thank you for being here. So before we start, it's always quite nice to give a bit of background. And I'm going to ask you both to sum up what your businesses do in 60 to 90 seconds. So who would like to go first, Tamara or Kate?
Well, we'll tell you what, shall I take The Social Element and you take Polpeo, Kate? Is that a good idea?
Good plan. Yeah.
Fantastic. Okay. The Social Element, formed 18 years ago, work with big global brands, helping them have a genuine human connection with their consumers. I think that pretty much sums it up in 90 seconds.
And Polpeo is a crisis simulation platform. So we train companies on how to prepare for a crisis as it breaks over social and digital media. And we do that using simulation technology.
Wonderful. Okay, there we go. My gosh. I mean, that is broken records. I believe that was probably 15 and 22 seconds. I didn't actually know. That was great. Thank you very much. Well, welcome to Tamara and Kate. I'm going to throw a whole bunch of questions at them as we go through the session. And like I said earlier, it'd be brilliant if you guys want to chip in. We will try and make the questions as smooth so we don't jump all over the place. So if I don't answer the question or ask the question that you ask immediately, it's because I'm looking for the great dovetail to come in so that it fits nicely into what we're talking about. But here we go. So I think the first question and the thing to kind of get out there first is, what is a crisis and why should marketeers care about crisis communications?
It's probably a good start, isn't it? So yeah, a crisis is something that impacts the ability of a brand to operate. So it has to have a significant impact on sales or share price or reputation. So it's usually something out of the norm. The pandemic definitely counts as a crisis. So I think everyone has been through a crisis. But it could be something like a boycott, maybe activists attacking a brand because of something they've done, maybe their own behavior, brand's behavior, or something in the supply chain. Or it could be something, logistical, like KFC running out of chicken was a crisis for them, because they sell chicken. So, it does depend, but it's an effect on sales, reputation or share price. And I guess coming back to the second question, why should marketers care? I think most brands do understand that there has to be a collaboration between PR and marketing, or comms and marketing. Kate comes from much more of a sort of PR crisis background. I'm from the sort of social media background. So that's why we kind of came together to create Polpeo, because we had sort of a bit of a different view on it. But the key is that it has to be joined up. It can't work in a silo. And I think so many brands will have really sort of found this, what we've all gone through over the last, I was going to say 12 years. What has it been? 12 months?
18 years? I don't know, 104 years.
But so it's so important that marketers can't leave it to the comms people to sort of sweep in and solve a crisis. Everything has to be done together.
And I'm going to add to that and say that I think in the past, we tended to think about managing a crisis as really managing media around a crisis, whereas now, of course, people are talking much more directly to their consumers on social media, which is very much a part of marketing. Crises tend to break on social, and if you're dealing with a changing way that consumers are behaving, so they're expecting different things from brands, they're expecting them to be more ethical, more transparent, they're holding them up to higher standards of behavior, and that all has a huge impact on marketing and how a brand markets themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the things you notice is people are now in this world, and I'm trying to think of a good phrase to explain it, but it's like they want everything now, right? And social gives them that opportunity to demand things from brands, from the clients who are trying to deal with this crisis. I mean, you must have seen that kind of tenfold over the last 9 months.
Yeah, completely. I mean, I think it was always the case that, we've, over the last decade, we've created an experience where people do want things faster. Social media just does that naturally. But I think when people are stressed, it's just human nature that they need the information there and then. And if they don't get it quickly, they go to other sources to get that information. So yeah, that speed is absolutely crucial.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's something that's hardwired into us as well. We tend to think about the speed at which we want everything as being something driven by technology, but it's not. It's a neuroscientific thing. It's something that's a really ancient instinct that we need information to make decisions quickly, often life and death decisions, or our ancient ancestors would have done. And so we always want things quickly. You know, it's not just technology enabling that. It's something that's actually hardwired into us.
Which is really interesting. And I presume together over the last 9 months, you've actually seen brands kind of, I imagine they've come to you, some in a panic, some kind of wanting advice, some kind of wanting a little bit of help on what they're doing. But you must have, over the last 9 months, seen a huge change in the way that brands are looking at crisis and how they deal with it. You know, it'd be great to gain your insight and tell us what you've seen. I mean, it'd be unbelievable, you know, some of the things I'm sure you've seen, been involved in. You can obviously name names if you want, but I totally get it if you don't want to. But it'd be good to get a feel.
I'm going to start off in a sort of, you know, a positive way. It's been incredible to see how brands have reacted during the pandemic. You know, companies like Louis Vuitton and Brewdog, and the fact that they sort of switched to making hand sanitizers. I know that the company that owns Zara, the name escapes me right now, but they switched to making scrubs in their, you know, in their factories and everything. And Mondelez, that happens to be a client of ours, I know that they were making visors, for example, like out of 3D printers. So it was incredible how brands stepped up. And in the UK particularly, I think the supermarkets were just incredible. It's almost like they taught us all how to remain civil with, you know, the fact that they brought in the regulations so quickly and you know, but also just doing things that it's funny, you forget now, because it does feel like there was sort of lockdown part 1 and part 2, but the fact that they were opening up the stores ahead of time for the elderly and the vulnerable to go in and just creating a sense of calm. I mean, that was, and I feel like they've all sort of worked together. So yeah, it's been incredible just sort of seeing what the brands have actually done for positive change.
And that's been about behavior, hasn't it? Not just about talking about, you know, nice things. They've actually changed their behavior in this crisis, and I think that is a really, really key lesson here, that it's what you do that matters in a crisis situation, not just what you say. And again, that's where this becomes really important to marketing and to the business. It's not just a communication issue when there's a crisis, because you do have to sometimes change behavior. And there have been some amazing stories. The car brands making ventilators, I mean, all sorts of incredible things. But I think what's interesting is that we've seen what amazing things brands can do for society if they put their minds to it. And what I'm really interested in is, after this is over, will we still expect that from brands? I think the way that brands market will fundamentally change as a result of this, because people will know now that they can do incredible, you know, real good for society, and they'll expect, I think, higher standards of behaviour as a result.
Absolutely. I mean, yeah, sorry, Tamara, far away.
No, carry on.
No, that's okay. I can come after. Go.
well, I was just going to say, because you were asking about what have brands sort of needed as well, because that's kind of what they've done for good. Yeah. But I know that they were contacting, you know, our clients definitely needed help with social listening. One of the key things was about, we kept using the phrase reading the room. It was almost like it was just hard to understand what was the best tone of voice to use while companies were sort of going through their own issues and having to sort of decide what they did in their own logistics and, you know, trying to sort of make people work from home and everything. Getting that tone of voice was crucial. And social listening, I think, came really into the fore, perhaps much more than before. I think that brands realize just how important it is to be able to understand what are our consumers thinking and feeling right now, and how can we actually use that to get the content strategy right, or know to shut up at this point, or what else should we say? So yeah, that was really, really key.
That's definitely going to carry on, isn't it? That if we are talking about what role do brands have in society, you know, we've seen that they do have a really clear role in doing societal good, beyond just their profit, and actually listening to what people expect from them is going to be really critical after this is over. Oh God, let's hope it's all over soon.
Yeah, well, let's hope so. Let's definitely hope so. And it's really interesting, and this does dovetail beautifully with two questions that have come in from our audience already. So someone has said they struggle with tone. So, you know, you touched on it there, Tamara, a little bit. How do you get it right in a crisis? Because they say you don't want to feel robotic, but equally it's hard to strike that right balance from being too blasé to being serious to being friendly. I mean, it's really, I know it's a huge question to ask and probably depends on each circumstance, but it'll be good to get kind of, you know, groundbreaker from your end.
Yeah, it was interesting because I think, you know, again, because of the combination of our two sort of areas in terms of comms and, you know, marketing, it's so important to sort of be aware of the tone of voice. And we realized that particularly with Polpeo, that what we were teaching people was empathy. And I think it's a word that has been used an awful lot, but it's so important that marketers understanding their audience and understanding how best to connect. So we've got this sort of thing about genuine human connections at the social element as well. So I think we did a lot of rewriting of social playbooks during this time, and really understanding, have we got the right tone of voice? There are times in a crisis that it is okay to use humor. So moving away from the pandemic, actually, if I just go back to the KFC one, because it's in my head now, I can't get it out. I love the way that KFC dealt with with their crisis, because as a reminder to people, they ran out of chicken, which was a big deal for them. You know, they had a supply chain issue. And they put a great ad out that just was just FKC, you know, sort of flip on their initials. They apologized for running out of chicken. They used humor. Their engagement was spot on. So I think it's understanding, when you understand your community and your consumers so well, you can just have this natural empathy to get the tone of voice right, and understanding when to sort of be quiet, when to sort of have gravitas. So yeah, that I think it's become such an important area for marketers this year, perhaps more than ever.
I've got a tip as well, just on the practical side of knowing whether your tone of voice is right. And this is something I do in crisis training a lot, which is read out loud what you're going to say and hear how it sounds, and get somebody to role play a person who's been affected by the crisis, and then read your statement to them and get them to tell you how it makes them feel. It's a really, really good trick. And if you, sometimes when you hear the words out loud, you think, oh God, that sounds a bit corporate. But if you get somebody to pretend they've been affected by the crisis and then imagine how they would feel, are you giving them the information they need in the right way? It's a really good tip.
Oh, I love that. I love that. It's really good. And on that, where we talk about tone and we talk about different platforms there are, someone has actually asked a question about, do you think you need a different crisis comm strategy per social platform, or just an overall vision that kind of works across everything?
Yeah, I mean, you can, I think, just in the same way that marketers think about their content strategy broken down by platforms, you know, you don't just push the same content out. It is all tailored to sort of appeal to the right audience, and taking advantage of the different sort of how the different platforms work. So crisis strategy can be tailored to the different platforms. But I think it's, you know, Instagram, obviously, it's very visual. You can use amazing images to sort of try and reinforce your strategy. There is this idea about matching where things are happening. So there's a very old example of crisis management where I think it was Asda had an issue where an ex-employee had put a video up on YouTube, and it didn't show, it was a terrible video, but it was also kind of rogue employee. And they actually put their own statement out on YouTube. So I think that can be really powerful to sort of speak to the different audiences on the same platform. But really it's about having a completely sort of connected strategy as well.
Okay, great. And Kate, you've you know, doing things in the social space that's not so great. Someone has asked specifically a question to you on Twitter. Should I take angry customers to direct messaging for damage limitation, or is it better PR to keep everything in the open? I mean, I think we've all been down that road, right?
Yeah, we have all been down on both sides probably as well.
Yes.
I think that it's important to be seen to be answering the question publicly, but then you can try and take the detail of the conversation onto DM. That's what I would say. So I think if you, it's what you don't want is for somebody to see a load of unanswered questions on your page, or just to see you keep saying, can you DM me? Can you DM me? I think it's important sometimes to get the resolution out in the open so that you're showing people that you are responding, and then get the detail off the public platform.
Well, that makes sense, because it's always difficult. I think we've all been tempted when someone says something horrible, as you are in the live space. You want to defend yourself immediately. That's your first thought. So you would kind of contemplate what's there and don't write back immediately? Would you say that's always a bad thing to do?
Always pause before you write back, just in case you write back something awful. Especially in a crisis situation, if you're dealing with people being really horrible to you on different platforms, at some point you're going to break. And we see this in our simulations, actually, when we run crisis simulations for a half day, and we put people through their paces, and at the beginning they're all really, they know exactly what they're going to say, and they've got their strategy, and they're all working together. And by about hour 2 or 3, the edges are starting to fray, they're starting to get fractious, they're starting to not care about what consumers are saying. They're lacking empathy, they're tired, they haven't hydrated properly, they haven't got up and walked around, so they're sitting in one place, and they're just fed up with being attacked, or what feels like being attacked. So I would always say, work out where you are in that cycle. And if you're right at the beginning, you can probably respond quickly. But if you're towards the end of that cycle and you're feeling tired, take a pause and just think before you respond.
That actually is a brilliant tip, and really refreshing to hear, because I think, we talk about that sort of thing happening. We've also got the worry of trolls, keyboard warriors. What are the most common things brands have to deal with? Obviously that stop and think before you write something is brilliant. But Kate, the point you make there as well, obviously there's education that needs to be done internally for teams, because you're right. If it's the end of the day or the conversation's been going on, how do you keep that empathy level up? How do the teams keep that going?
You have to switch out your teams. If you possibly can, switch out your teams, or bring other people in to help, so that you can take regular breaks. If you don't take regular breaks, you are going to end up making a mistake. It's just human nature. There's nothing wrong. I quite often hear people in crisis teams going, I pulled an all-nighter, and it's almost a badge of honor to do that. But actually, you're not going to be performing your best. You have to take regular breaks. Go outside, do some mindful, whatever works for you. Go for a walk. Just do something that takes you away, and then you get some perspective. But because you're going to deal, all the things that you mentioned there are the things you'd have to deal with, trolling, outrage. People are so angry. They're just so angry all the time. And of course, that's all fed by the social media algorithms as well, isn't it? If you post something that you find outrageous, we wear our outrage as a kind of badge of honor. This says something about me, that I'm outraged by this thing, so I'm going to post it on Twitter, and therefore everyone knows I'm a good person. And then, of course, the algorithms say, you like this story that's outrageous, so I'm going to send you more information that's outrageous, and then you get more outraged, and the anger just gets greater and greater. And we talk about, I wrote a book on communicating in a crisis, imaginatively called Communicate in a Crisis. And when I was doing the research for this, there are all sorts of studies done into the increasing levels of outrage on social media, and we are actually genuinely becoming more angry, and it is being fed by these algorithms, really. And it's just absolutely fascinating. And you get this amazing polarization where somebody posts something on Facebook or Twitter, somebody else finds it outrageous, so they start attacking that person, and then sorry, I realised I've got really big hands on the screen there. And then if you wait long enough, another group of people come along, and they start attacking the first group of people. So you get this polarization, you get these extremes of debate, and people in the middle are just too tired to get involved, so they just don't. So all you see is these extremes all the time, and that's exhausting to deal with. But I think the other big thing, actually, that we must mention is the spread of disinformation and misinformation at the moment, and that is especially in the pandemic. The misinformation that is spread. So, and by disinformation, I mean, deliberately false information that's being planted. But there are also a lot of people spreading misinformation without realizing it. These rumors about was the vaccine something that was being developed by Bill Gates in order to sterilize mass groups of people, or is 5G causing COVID, and all those kind of things that were just spreading around perfectly sensible people's networks, because everyone was frightened, and that's terrifying to have to deal with that. And as a brand, you may well be caught up in that as well. There was a really interesting thing with Wayfair, the home furnishings company, where somebody started a rumor that they were naming their cabinets after girls who were being trafficked in their supply chain. I mean, it just came out of nowhere. It was a kind of QAnon thing. And now you'd never think as a furniture brand that you're going to have to come out and say, we do not traffic children. I mean, that's just not something that you think is going to happen. Right. Particularly not if you name your cabinets after them. It's the most extraordinary thing. So all these things we're having to deal with now. Sorry, that was a very long answer, sorry.
No, it's brilliant. That Wayfair, I didn't even know about that, which is
amazing.
Absolutely outrageous. I mean, if you are Wayfair, it's brilliant to talk about an example. What's your first kind of steps if you Wayfair had come to you and said, we've got this, it's completely fake. What would your advice be? Where would you go first? What would be the first thing you do?
I think what they did, which was to just come out straight away and say, there is no truth in this. This is absolutely categorically not true. Because even when you think, oh, it's so ridiculous, no one will believe it. If you don't say anything, then people go, oh, they kept very quiet on that issue. Maybe there was something in their supply chain. Maybe they're hiding something else. And there's all these things. You have to put a stake in the ground and say, this is categorically not true. And I think, it did go away, that issue for them. But must have been a real pain to have to deal with it.
Yeah, not one that you'd normally see on the risk register.
No, exactly.
And you see all these things and all the things that the brands have to worry about. I mean, one of the things for me is there things out there now when you see brands and you see them respond or they act in a certain way during a crisis? What can they be doing differently as a collective? What are if you had a checklist, what are the things they need to ensure they've got in place before they kind of launch into any crisis comms response?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think it does come back down to things like listening to the audience. So getting that, the reading the room. So it's almost, so taking the pause, as Kate said, you have to understand what the situation is, because it can be worse. There's almost this balance that you have to respond quickly, because if you don't respond, the sort of the public get their information from somewhere else, and it can be completely untrue, and they're getting it from QAnon or something like that. So you do have to get out information quickly, but it has to be factual, because there's nothing worse than coming out with something that is just not right, and then you lose that credibility. So part one is definitely listening to the audience, understanding what the issue is. I think transparency is important, just being aware, even if a brand doesn't quite know what the situation is, it's better to come out with the facts, and also something like, we're aware of this situation, we are trying to find out more information, or something that shows that something is being done. I think going back to what we were saying, that people are just so fast to jump on things that they're not necessarily going to wait, but there is this sort of sense you can actually manage a crowd by giving this information so that they calm down and they're not kind of constantly sort of attacking. So that's sort of part of it. And I think it is about just building this trust as well. So we do have a bit of a phrase about banking goodwill, something that I'm obviously very passionate about it because it's my sort of expert area, but it's managing communities and doing great engagement. So when brands are talking in the everyday world of just getting back to consumers, sometimes it's just, lovely customer loyalty responses. I mean, sometimes we respond to consumers with like poems because we're just like riffing with them. But you do that, one, because it's great marketing, it's great loyalty, but it does bank this goodwill, because actually if consumers are deeply in love with a brand, they're less likely to attack them when something does inevitably go wrong, and it will go wrong, because it's not a case of, if a crisis happens, it's when a crisis happens. But by investing in this great community management, you can kind of build up that trust and good faith.
I'm going to add a couple of things to that as well, which is the first thing is to set the intent of the crisis. We talked a little bit about that earlier, but very specifically, when a crisis breaks, it's very easy to just get straight into the doing and not spend any time thinking what you want the impact of that crisis to be on your business and on your customers. So think about 6 months to a year down the line. In a crisis, you tend to think about, how do I survive today, tomorrow, this week, next week? But you want your leader to really think about, what do we want to have happened in 6 months' time? So is that we want to keep customer loyalty, or is that, we want to make sure that this event never happens again, and we're going to keep our customers safe by doing this, that, and the other. So just really clearly set the intent for the crisis. I think that then informs everything you do. And the other thing I would say is stick to your values. Very often company values kind of go out of the window in a crisis, and they're incredibly important. You need to behave by your values. This is where your values really will have a light shone on them. And there's no room for corporate messaging in a crisis response. This is not the time to talk about we value the health and safety of our employees if you've just had an explosion at a plant and 50 people have been killed. There's no room for that message. That's not what people are going to want to hear from you. They're going to want to hear what you do, what you're going to do about it, and how you're going to stop it ever happening again. So I would say be very, very cautious about putting your company messages into a statement, but do communicate in accordance with your values.
I mean, that's a really good list. I mean, there's some things here that I'm sure the audience have never even thought about, which is absolutely brilliant. And what should brands, we talk about, this is the checklist of what they should do. What can they do? What are the common mistakes you see? I mean, there's obviously a few in there where you've obviously seen before brands in a crisis have started to kind of mix up what the crisis is with their brand values and try to sell one against the other, and it doesn't work. What are the other common mistakes that you see from brands on a regular basis?
Yeah, I think it is about being too inward focused, so they're not reading the room, I suppose, to sort of pick up on what we were saying before. Getting the tone of voice wrong, that is a classic. We see that all the time. You see examples of that so much. And I think, the public are more savvy. They will say, you're being too corporate, you're being too robotic, and or you just landed it completely wrong. So I think, not showing empathy, not getting the tone of voice right, being too slow. Again, it's trying to find when is the time to sort of be quick with the facts. But if they're too slow, things are changing so quickly. And as Kate would say, there's almost like it can run away with you, and there'll be a whole group attacking you if you're not sort of getting back in time. And I think behavior is really important. I mean, we touched on values, but I think if a brand jumps in with a sort of empty statement and it doesn't match with their values, or for example, we saw this with the Black Lives Matter movement, where lots of brands they didn't really have the right to get into the conversation because they perhaps didn't have a great track record, or and so that was not great at all. So I think you have to get the tone of voice right. You have to earn the right to be in the conversation.
Yeah, and that is all about behaviour. And we saw, as Tamara said, in the Black Lives Matter movement, there were some really interesting examples of organisations, who, beauty brands, for example, who were putting black squares on their Instagram pages and tweeting support for Black Lives Matter movement. But then when you look at actually how their businesses run, they were selling skin whitening creams to women in Africa and Asia and the Middle East. And you think, well, that behaviour is not really compatible with what they're saying. So what they're saying doesn't match what they're doing. And they were, in my view, rightly called out on that. Some of the big organisations have changed their policy now on skin lightening creams, which is great, specifically as a result of the Black Lives Matter backlash against them. And yeah, you just need to really think about what you're saying. Does it match what you're actually doing?
It's a lot to take on board, and I think comes with that, which would be a really good question to you guys, is in terms of internally, how do companies, how do brands set up? Do they need someone who specifically works on crisis comms? Do you need a minimum of, say, 2 or 3 people, depending on the size of the company. I mean, there's a lot there to take on. And I know we mentioned earlier that it falls within the marketing team as well, but there must be a point where actually good practice would be to have someone kind of who has got a great crisis comms campaign, a strategy written, but also, you know, whether it's 1 or 2 people. It seems an awful lot to try and put together. And obviously you've got to stay calm under pressure, which is key.
Yeah. And of course, you should have a lot of this identified. So you should have the people identified who are going to be part of your crisis comms team. It will inevitably be somebody from marketing, somebody from PR, a business leader. We know brands who have a business leader who is assigned to the crisis team until the crisis is over. All this stuff should be written really into your crisis plan and rehearsed, of course, so that everyone knows exactly what they're doing. Because if you're scrambling around to try and work this stuff out when the crisis has hit, then you're in trouble. You want to have worked it all out beforehand, and that includes who your go-to person is going to be in crisis comms.
Yeah, and get legal involved, HR,
your PR agency.
Yeah.
So that's an interesting point there, Kate, when you say about rehearsing. So is that an issue with some brands? They put together a wonderful strategy, a great plan, and they may have rehearsed it once, then 4 years later, they haven't rehearsed it again. Is there,
yeah.
You know, you should probably be doing something like this, I don't know, maybe 2-3 times a year, you would imagine. But.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's exactly why we created Polpeo, right? I mean, it's just because we wanted something that we would use. You know, my background is PR, as Tamara said, hers is social media. We wanted something that we would want to use with our clients to make sure they didn't get themselves into trouble. So that's exactly why we created this. Initially as a tool to use, and then spun it out as a separate company later. And we realised actually everybody needs to do this stuff. And yeah, you really do need to rehearse. It's all very well having a sort of dusty crisis manual that somebody goes, my God, does anyone know where it is? And you know, these days obviously they're all online, or hopefully. Not always, I have to say.
Fingers crossed.
yeah, exactly. But you know, what do I do? And if you want to override your natural instinct, which is fight, flight, or freeze. When you go into a crisis, even if it's you perceive a threat, whether it's a social threat or a physical threat, you have the same chemical and brain reactions, and you go into fight, flight, or freeze, and you need to rehearse in order to override those instincts. And what you're doing by rehearsing and training is really locking in a new instinct. It's a new way of behaviour that stops you running away, kicking back against it, or freezing. And there's a lovely, again, when I'm doing training, I always say to people, there's my father, who was a soldier, and he's 85 now, and he used to parachute when he was a very young man in his 20s for the army. And he hasn't parachuted for 60 years, but he fell down the steps at the back of his house recently, and instead of putting his arms out and breaking his fall like that, and probably breaking an arm or a wrist or a hip or something, he went into a parachute roll instinctively. Now, he hasn't done that for 60 years. So that's what you're trying to do. You're trying to lock in that kind of behavior, so that when whatever hits the fan, you're just going to go instinctively into the right actions. And that's what we try and do.
Yeah, it's kind of building resilience training as well, isn't it?
Exactly.
It's brilliant. And just before we go on to a couple more questions, a lovely comment from the audience has come in. They say, it's so refreshing to hear the panel being so honest. Empathy is key. Best session I've been to in a while. Loving this. Thanks, guys. And it's no one from any of our teams, so that is good. So that puts it in a good place. But, you know, we talk about, you know, having the right teams, the right strategy in place. We've been through this crisis over the last 9 to 12 months, which, as Tamara said, seems like 12 years. It genuinely does. What's next? What are the big threats on the horizon that you can see coming towards brands? And from a crisis comms perspective, what next?
I mean, there are all sorts, aren't there? You know, everyone's talking a lot about environmental sustainability, societal impact of brands, governance, the kind of big ESG, as it's known, things. I think those are the things that really people should be looking at. Is not just the profit. What place do brands have beyond profit in society? And that's really what ESG is all about, in my view. But also things like diversity and inclusion. I think you kind of have to. It goes back to what Tamara said about reading the room. To really understand what's coming over the horizon, you have to be constantly scanning it. You have to see what those threats are, what other people are doing, what people are talking about, what they care about. and really do a full audit. And we partner with, I mentioned Rod Cartwright earlier, and we partner with him. He's created this amazing thing called Match Fit, which audits all the kind of threats that are potentially coming over the horizon to your company, but also how ready you are to deal with all those threats. And he specifically looks at it through a kind of ESG lens. And so I think those are the really big things.
And I think brands are so much more open to this now because, you know, let's face it, no one saw the pandemic coming, and there was a lot of preparation that has gone on while we're all going through it. So I think brands are much more open to the idea of like what could come next. Let's make sure we're ready next time.
Although interestingly, of course, some people did see it. The World Health Organization saw it coming, for example. It's just that we weren't listening. I think people, and as a society, we weren't listening because it was so unbelievable. Yeah. We didn't think it could happen, but there were signs of it, and we just weren't open to those signs.
It's really interesting because there's so much in here, right? I suppose one thing we haven't even touched on yet is budgets, and how do you think one of the common things amongst brands that you're seeing, are they putting enough of their budget, their PR budgets, their marketing budgets, their comms budgets into crisis comms? Do you think there's a lack there? Do you think that maybe not, maybe some get it right, some don't, obviously, but do you think in a general overview, are there not enough brands paying enough attention to it?
Some are putting really significant effort and budget into crisis comms training. Some are not, and it's very easy not to, because you think, oh, I'll worry about that tomorrow, and you think about the more immediate stuff, and people tend to focus on crisis when either they're going through it and it's too late to think about preparation at that point, obviously, or when they've been through a crisis and they then don't want to go through a second one, or when one of their competitors has gone through a crisis and they suddenly think that could happen to me. So there's usually a trigger. The biggest companies are investing in this stuff, of course they are. I mean, they know that they have to, their future depends on being prepared for a crisis. I think we all now assume that any organisation will go through some sort of crisis, whether it's a data breach or a product issue or a sustainability issue or a random backlash thing. We have to be prepared for it. So I think there is a greater awareness now than perhaps there was even 10 years ago.
I would say also that there perhaps was a more traditional approach to doing, say, like a large scale simulation. That would be a case of fly everybody in to an office, or maybe rent out a hotel or something like that. And, there was a lot of investment in terms of travel and people's time, and therefore trying to do something which makes a lot of sense, i.e. a simulation, would be a big deal and maybe happen once a year. As a result of the fact that people can't travel anymore and, get into offices together, the whole thing has shifted to running them virtually. And I think people have realized that it doesn't need to be as big an investment in terms of their travel and budgets. So we've noticed that trend, that people are now seeing that this is something that they don't want to just keep to a small core of 12 people. They actually want to roll it out to marketing teams. And whereas perhaps it did used to be more focused on PR and comms. So I think it's now spreading out to the rest, to other teams.
Which is brilliant, right? And what we want to see. And actually it ties in very nicely with a question as well that's just come in around how should marketing teams respond to changes and defend budgets? Are there any suggestions of how and where to move budget to stay effective in such a volatile time?
I think I'm going to go back to the sort of tone of voice and community management. I think if you can focus on what you are saying and keeping an eye on that, it's almost like if you can try and keep everything under control and keep everyone happy in terms of great loyalty marketing, customer service, whatever you want to call it, but just talking back to people on social media, half of the problem will go. You won't have to then sort of be on the back foot and dealing with a crisis because you're doing the work up front. So I would argue that spend the budget on preparation rather than having to spend a lot more money and losing a lot of money because you're actually going through a crisis.
I always like to use the reversal technique as well. What happens if you don't? what are the implications if you don't invest in this stuff, and look at what the risks are. And that quite often helps you just to identify where you want to spend budget, because you think, what happens if I don't spend it there? What's the natural conclusion? And quite often, yeah, that's a good way of focusing your mind on what really matters.
Great. I love that. And is there anything you've seen, in the last 9 or 12 months that's, you're at the point and the sharp end of crisis comms? Is there anything you've seen that's absolutely shocked you, or anything you've seen, my gosh, I wouldn't have acted like that or seen that? Has anything got out there and you thought, wow, that's really stunning?
Tamara's much better than me, because Tamara always says we shouldn't call out brands that are doing it really badly. And I tend to run my mouth off a bit on these things. But,
yeah, actually, to choose a non-pandemic example, I've sort of used this case study before. It is one of my favourites, and it did end up in a happy place, so it's okay to talk about it.
Okay.
So, United Airlines, I think a lot of people would have been aware of when they had to take passengers off the plane, and they ended up essentially that security guards were dragging a person off the plane, which was videoed, went viral, and their reputation was being absolutely hammered. They didn't respond quickly enough, and when they did respond, their first response was apologizing to the other passengers rather than the passenger who'd been dragged off the plane. So again, if we talk about having empathy, reacting in the right way, getting the facts, all of those things, you can see that they didn't have the facts, they didn't have the empathy, they were slow. It got a lot better, and they did have an appropriate response in the end, thank goodness. But I think it's a kind of a good example, and I think a lot of professionals in the area were just like, oh my God, that is not great. So luckily that was a few years ago. I haven't seen anything really bad.
I'm going to say Wetherspoons in the pandemic. I was trying not to say it, but I can't keep it in. So Wetherspoons chairman Tim Martin was pretty roundly criticised for saying that Wetherspoons wouldn't pay its staff until the government furlough scheme kicked in. And he told them all to get jobs at Tesco instead. And he did this in a really bizarre video that was sort of filmed with him having a cup of coffee and his hand in a bandage, which wasn't really explained. And he ended up by just with him pointing at the camera and saying, good luck, a bit in the kind of like Alan Sugar saying, you're fired. It was really strange. And he came under huge pressure, and there was, he had some of his pubs graffitied and all that kind of stuff. And eventually he said he would be paying staff, but really he could have avoided that whole situation by showing a bit of empathy with what his team were going through.
Absolutely, gosh. And look, we're nearly at the end, because we almost reached our 45-minute limit. In fact, we have, which is no surprise. We always seem to go over, but such great insight here. One comment I would like to mention, which I've left to the end, which was one of the first ones actually. It was one of the early comments we made and the panel made. And he said, I'm going to send my boss this video. A crisis isn't just one person's responsibility. Have to work together as a company and have a plan in place. I like that. That's, but, from what I've extrapolated from you guys so far today, like having that empathy, taking your time, making sure you've got the facts right, all seem to be the key driver. And I'm sure, we're going to see crisis comms rise to the fore over the next few years, because we really don't know what's going to happen and how volatile the world is going to be, isn't it? So I wanted to say thank you very much. I hope you don't mind me saying this next thing, but if you do have any questions, want to reach out to Tamara or Kate, please let us know and we will connect you. Thank you for being with us on our final Festival Fridays of 2020. What a way to end it. I don't actually want to stop the conversation because it's been really good, but I am aware, obviously, it's 3:45 in the UK, 4:45 in Europe, and I know it's morning in the US, but I know it's a Friday also. So thank you very much for being with us. Let's give a round of applause to Kate and Tamara. So we're doing that in a virtual space.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thanks for having us on.